Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of SUGTalks. I'm Craig Dale, your host, and together with our special guest, we will take a deep dive into the topics, challenges and opportunities facing SAP users today. Please make sure you subscribe so you never miss another episode. I'm delighted today to be joined once again by Simon Nichols, Wellbeing Director at Thrive. And I think today's episode has even more significance and a special place in that we're actually doing it in person for the first time.
We're in the same room.
we're not on Zoom. We're not on any other remote location. We're in the same room around the same table. So, Simon, welcome.
Thank you for having me. And I'm always. It's always a yes. There's never, when the emails come through and it's like, do you think you're available? And it's yes. And I always try and change my diary at that point because I'm so honoured, actually, genuinely, that you asked me back and to be part of, SUGTalks is just a real delight for me to be. So thank you for being here. And I can let everyone know that Craig, obviously, if you've only ever heard Craig or seen a video of him, is you should really get to meet him in person. He's a lovely, lovely gentleman. And I can see that now, obviously, because we're really here in the same room as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Simon. I appreciate that. Might as well end the episode there, really. So, yeah, in today's mental health focused episode, we're going to be discussing how to create positive work environments with a focus on stress management. And for those perhaps that have listened to these podcasts before, you may be sensing a kind of change in my voice. And I've had a bit of a head cold in the week. I've been struggling to maintain my voice. And for once, it's not alcohol related either. But speaking of alcohol, we're coming up to Christmas.
We are.
And I thought I'd ask, what is your favourite festive tipple?
You've put me in a really difficult position now because we all know, and I'm going to use before I talk about my Simon Loves Christmas, we have to talk about the alcohol. Alcohol bad. Okay, that's all your listeners should know that. And however, I always try not to be the mental health police and say, as long as it's in moderation.
I was just going to say everything in moderation.
Everything
Simon.
in moderation. And I'm going to whisper this because we don't want anyone else to know this, but you can get endorphins, which is the feel-good chemical. It's the stuff we get from exercise. You can get endorphins from dark chocolate and red wine, but don't tell anyone.
Wow.
So my favourite tipple. So my wife, Kelly, has bought me Bailey's Tia Maria.
Oh,
yeah, exactly. I've got no idea what it's going to be like. So I don't even know if that's going to be my favourite tipple, but it sounds incredible because at heart, I just like milkshakes. So any form of alcohol that has a milkshakey type of approach. But I think actually, if I because I'm old now. I'm 50 next year. It's so A, I can't drink as much alcohol as I used to, but B, obviously I only really drink red wine and real ale now, and both lovely when it comes to Christmas because it's just that warming sort of sensation. It makes me sound like a chronic alcoholic. I've got this Bailey's Tia Maria. I've got red wine, but actually what I do like is I just like if I am having a drink and in moderation. Actually, it's about the company. Mm-hmm. And, it doesn't matter. I can have soda water and lime as long as the company's good. And I think that's what the build up to Christmas is about, is actually going out somewhere and just being together with your friends and family. And if there's a nice glass of Malbec available, then I'll probably be having that as well.
You know what, that is exactly when I asked the question, what immediately came to my mind is always have bottle of Pinot Noir with the turkey, with family round at Christmas lunch, and that is immediately my favourite drink. And you're spot on. It's who you're drinking it with.
Exactly.
And it's perfect. Back to your Bailey's Tia Maria, if I may, just before we move on. Okay, I use Tia Maria in an espresso martini.
Yes.
Now, try that as an espresso martini with Bailey's in it. That might make an interesting little tipple.
We're going down a completely digressionary rabbit hole here, aren't we? But yes, let's keep that. And if any of our listeners wants to write in and say they've tried that, we'll take that on board.
Okay. And please note, this is not a drink to manage stress with. So back onto our main focus of conversation. As we head into the festive season, it's fair to say we all face some extra pressure and stress in our lives. I mean, we're actually recording this at our annual conference, and that can cause a hell of a lot of stress as we go through the year in the build up to the event. But of course, for some people, it can be a case all year round where they're struggling with stress. And with that in mind, it'd be interesting to dive into what trends we're seeing around stress management, how employers and team leaders can create a work environment that's positive and as stress-free as possible. So, Simon, I'm sure you face some stress that our listeners might have experienced themselves, and arguably post-pandemic world, I should say, has probably magnified some of those. So to start us off, could you share what you and your team at Thrive are seeing in terms of trends around stress in the workplace at the moment?
Yeah, so stress has been with us since the year dot. Stress is a good thing. It motivates us. It drives us forward. And we can get all scientific, but we're absolutely not today. Because what we're thinking is, when we think about stress in the workplace, when we think about workplace pressure, because pressure's all around us at all time. Yeah. It's work, it's home, it's Christmas, it's events, it's finances, all of these things, and they're all external forces. And that's what we got to remember, because I've used the word pressure and I've used the word force. That's what we've got to be thinking about. Because if we think about stress as a bad thing, it starts to impact the way stress affects us. So we have to think of stress as our fight and flight. And for those of you that have done any of the webinars, you'll have seen we talk about fight and flight pretty much every webinar, because it's a base function of human need and human society. We're talking about the mismanagement of stress, and I've just introduced another word there, haven't I? Management. So when we think about force and pressure and management, that's where we potentially as employers try to get it wrong. Because what we do is we focus on what we can change within the workplace. But someone said to me yesterday, in fact, I'm starting to build a life-work balance. Have you heard it called that before?
It starts with work-life balance, and I like that.
So what do we need to do? Well, actually, we need to look at all facets. So yes, we can say, as a workplace, what am I doing? What am I putting in place? Am I making my staff or my employees, am I making them aware that I actually care about their pressures, their forces, both inside of work and outside? So when we start to think about trends, unfortunately, stress is still the thing that we leave behind. And I think I've said to you a few times that wonderful analogy that we all get sent warning signs. We all get sent triggers, especially when we're at work. We're sitting down and we're just focusing on our report, and then Deirdre or Duncan from accounts comes over and they give us another piece of work, and then someone else's, and suddenly we're deluged, we're overwhelmed. And what do? Well, we kick in our fight and flight. And you're thinking, hold on, these are just a couple of people putting some reports or asking for a bit of information. But our perceived danger still goes back to saber-toothed tigers. I've just had two saber-toothed tigers, Duncan and Deirdre, and they're attacking me. They're not. They're just putting a little bit of extra pressure or tension into our lives. But our brains don't differentiate between Duncan and Deirdre being saber-toothed tigers or just really nice people from accounts. I've now got more stuff to do and more pressure. So when we think about the management of that, and that's really important when we think from a workplace. So the trend that we're seeing at the moment is actually our workplaces, our management teams, actually thinking about their employees, or are they thinking about that end result? Now, if that end result is, well, if we reduce stress for everybody, everyone will have a much happier relationship, and they'll come into work and they'll be more positive. That's brilliant. That's a wonderful attitude to have. But am I really supporting individual X? And it's weird to think about, especially if you've got an employee list of 25,000 people. It's hard to think of an individual employee. But we've got to have that mindset. And actually we are seeing that now, because what we used to see was organisations would come to us and say, we need to roll out a stress webinar. And we're like, brilliant, okay, in order for that to be effective, maybe 50 people on it, we need to roll it out for 2,000. So one webinar for 2,000 people. Yeah, just to make them know we care. And it's like, it's not, you're not really. So we're actually seeing now a more focused approach. So that awareness is not just a webinar. It's actually a focused change in that culture. And we're seeing that more and more now because people are realizing. So I'm going to get all technical here, everybody, but Craig will know this for absolute certainty. The ICD-10 scale, which was the diagnostic criteria, is now been superseded by ICD-11.
Wow!
Wow! Exactly, and that is some of the diagnosis criteria for mental ill health conditions. And one of the key things about ICD-11, there's people switching off now. I do apologise, but for the first time ever in diagnostic depression or diagnosis of clinical depression, is stress. We've recognised it for the first time that stress, even though we've known that forever, it's now been recognised as a proponent, as a key component of potential depression. Some statistics that some of the listeners may not realise is that depression has actually risen from 2019 of 5.2 million to 11.2 million in 2021. So we've seen a huge rise in that diagnosis of depression as a direct result of stress, because people are starting to recognise that. They had a bit of time to think about all the stuff going on in the pandemic, and actually they're starting to recognise that. So we're slowly starting to see the workplaces coming round to that thing. If I can help one employee manage their stress, they might need a few days off work, they might need a couple of weeks off work, but actually let's focus on it now so we're not off work for 6 months, for 9 months. And I think that's really starting to come around because they are thinking about the employee first rather than let's just roll out a sort of a cursory mandatory tick box.
Yeah, and you mentioned age earlier, and I'm not even going to enter that discussion, but I've been in employment for a lot of years, shall we say, and you talked earlier about force, pressure, and management. And in many years gone by, it was seen as management's job to exert force and pressure and therefore stress on the employees.
Yeah.
And obviously, we've seen such a shift. And, if we go back to that era and we think about that, how can stressed employees affect an organisation and its culture?
When you think about what happens with stress, okay, and we go back to our fight and flight, when a person is in danger, they will react or do something different, won't they? They will make decisions based on their primal fear, which is that I'm under pressure, and I've got this overbearing sales manager, let's just for want of a better term, and they're forcing me to. What am I going to do? Well, when we think about our stress overwhelm, what's actually happening is an inordinate amount of various different chemicals, which we won't get into here, but is just basically blowing our mind, quite literally, and it's causing us to experience what we call emotional snapping. What that does is affect our memory. It affects our competency. It affects everything within our focus gets almost defocused. So let's just say that your employee is working on a production line, and actually their stress levels are so much that they're actually not even concentrating. They're not remembering to do the job they're meant to do, which is, changing a widget and moving a module. That all goes out the window, and they're now changing modules and moving widgets. And you think, multiply that by the amount of individuals that are stressed in an organisation to the point of thinking of leaving. Because that's the thing, what are we doing? Well, when we think about an individual coming into work and the effects of stress, what's it going to cause them to do? It's going to cause them to keep thinking about stuff, which means they're not really going to be doing the work in front of them. Or actually start to harbour those negative thoughts because actually I'm not thinking clearly, and every little thing is now a major issue. So suddenly you get people thinking, well, I need to leave because I can't cope with what I'm doing today. So you ask about the impact. The impact to a workplace is severe because you've suddenly got workers disinterested, disengaged, and more importantly, suffering, struggling. They're not doing their job in the way they need to do. But let's take it one step further than that, because stress kills. We have to talk about it. 120,000 people a year in the US die of stress-related illness. This is really pressure on the heart, for want of a different word. So when we think about stress actually being really damaging for our physical as well as our mental health, well, what does that mean for your workforce? Let's say even 10% of your workforce is running at a burnout or an overwhelm level. That's 10% of your workforce not functioning anywhere near where they need to be. And then that stress untouched may lead to anxiety disorders, may lead to depression. And suddenly you've got people that are off work 6, 9, 12 months recovering from something that could have been tweaked very early on if only you knew it was happening.
Wow, it's quite the way it affects. So we're talking there, affecting the effect on people, the fact that stress kills, and obviously that impacts people, their moods, their health, and also that will surely have an entropic effect on workplace culture. Yes. And a negative effect on that. What can, obviously you said earlier that it's now being shown that employees are starting to put employees first. So what are the first steps employees can do to start better supporting employees?
I think acknowledging, or at least having an understanding from a senior leadership team that it's something that could be affecting their company, because, as you know, there's typically I hate using the word male bravado because males are rubbish at stress, and we see that executive burnout happening, and in actual fact, women or individuals identify as women are actually much more open with their feelings, which means that they're able to lower their stress levels much more effectively than men. But when we think about senior leaders, it's like, well, I got through it. This is just how it is. Why don't we just carry on like this? Well, do you know what? You're a senior leader. You may be a little bit older than some of your employees. And is it right that just because you got through it, that someone else should now, who's not maybe as strong as you mentally, is now struggling? Because actually, there's a lovely quote, and I can never remember the quote, but it says if I got through it, I want to watch someone else suffer. And you think, what a horrible way of looking at it, isn't it? But that's what we do. It's like, oh well, man up, get over it. I had to deal with that when I was a salesman or salesperson, so do you. And you're like, well, no, let's support. And what type of leader actually has that mentality? So when we think about education, what we should be doing is educating the senior leadership team. Is there a problem? No, of course not. We've done a staff survey that had everybody's, wasn't anonymous. So everyone, and everyone seems to be okay, really. But actually what we need to be doing is understanding that it's something that affects all of us. We are not immune from that stress burnout in the slightest. In actual fact, senior leaders probably need a lot more support. But it's acknowledging that there's an issue in the first place. 3.4 million people are currently off work or have a diagnosis that they should be off work due to stress. 3.4 million people in the UK. It's just it's a scary number. And if these people don't manage that stress, don't take the time out, it could potentially lead to depression, to anxiety disorders, and potentially, we have to use a suicide word. People can't cope anymore. But let's put something in front of all of this. Let's be proactive with what we can do. Let's, senior leadership team, acknowledge that maybe their staff are going through something different. And we haven't, just because we're senior leaders, we can't check in with everyone. But maybe we can check in with our management teams. And managers, what have you been seeing? oh, okay, maybe we need to educate the management layer as well now. So it's about just taking it one step at a time without going, oh, let's just put a webinar on and hopefully everyone turns up. It's a different mindset that needs to be changed.
Yeah, in past episodes, we've discussed mindfulness and dealing with positivity and negativity in detail. I can imagine a lot of what we've said in those episodes is relevant to dealing with stress and improving our mental health. But a lot of those techniques were focused on the individual.
Yeah.
And when it comes to reducing stress in the workplace, you mentioned there putting on a webinar for 2,000 people, it is, and we've also said the onus on the employers and the leaders and the organisation of a whole. So is the onus on the employers?
I think it has to be, but it also, and we do a couple of wonderful. We do a lot of wonderful training sessions, but one about is the gift of happiness, and I love delivering that one. And it's about enabling people to realise that it's not up to the senior management team to make you happy at work. If you're feeling unhappy at work, you actually have to do something about it in the first place. But the management team, the employers, the senior leadership team must have put something in place that will foster your happiness. Now, not create it. It's not that you have to come in every morning and make everyone in your office happy, because that isn't the case at all. But you have to create an environment where people could feel supported, feel wanted. And happiness doesn't come from just sort of, I've watched an episode of Only Fools and Horses, that makes me happy. But it comes about our lived experiences and our pool of happiness, which is really quite a weird way to look at it. But sometimes we have to rely on our previous happiness to draw from that and be happy. I know I've digressed slightly, but there is a reason I will come back full round to what you're saying, because happiness isn't necessarily a state that we need to be in all the time. But actually, if we go to work, not necessarily being happy, but feeling content, feeling okay. Because what I'm talking about there is I'm not feeling like I want to, metaphorically fall off my chair because of the stress and the overwhelm. So when we think about what employers can do, they can create a culture. They can create an environment, they can create a workplace that is capable of fostering happiness or fostering contentment within their workforce. And it might be as simple as seeking the sentiment of their staff on a survey, an anonymous survey, that say, what are the top 3 things that would make you absolutely love to come into the office? Now, there'll be whimsical ones. I want a limousine to drive me into the office every day. But it could just be, I'd really like some fruit. I'd really like, a pinball table. So all of these things could actually, and for if you've got an employee force of 25,000, actually putting in a pinball table in one of the offices isn't actually that bad. This is not, we're not asking someone to pay for a trip to the moon. So we can start to put in very small, reasonable adjustments that will actually foster an environment to grow and to thrive. Because you talked about positivity then as well. And we know that positivity is one of my favourite sayings, increases productivity 33%, increases the change in the way people think. So if we start to foster a positive environment by an awareness that the senior management actually care about you, Craig, it's not, I'm a person. I've got things going on. I've got life outside of this. I've got a life-work balance I'm trying to work on. And actually, I feel supported. It's not a hard concept to put in place. But for some people who have that mentality that, oh, well, I struggled, I don't see why anyone else can't struggle as well, that's the wrong way to look at it. We need to put everything we can in place to create a culture of support and contentment that will allow people to then bring their own happiness into the place as well.
And back to the cultural aspects, and of course, you mentioned an employee workforce or a team of 2,000 or whatever. And, in the world of SAP, you mentioned earlier salespeople, sales teams and the pressure on them. And of course, on the other side, you've got developers who probably have a different set of pressures. So if we look at that, and back to your point of not just putting on one webinar for 2,000 people, are the cultural challenges across teams different, and something an organisation needs to be aware of when implementing these measures?
Absolutely. And I mean, let's look at organisations, even organisations slightly ahead of the curve. So we've we've put in a big awareness programme. We've put lots of posters up on the wall. We've engaged with large organisations and small organisations like ourselves. We've rolled out mental health first aider training. We've rolled out champion training. We've put all of this on. We've sort of enabled everybody. And we're still seeing a level of stress. Well, what's gone on? I mean, I've paid all this money out. I've done all this effort, but fundamentally, what we've done is we've come at it from the front ending. We haven't really put a strategy in place. We haven't really said, well, when we've got 150 mental health first aiders, what are we going to do with them? What are we going to promote each week, each day? Are we going to put out Wellbeing Wednesdays? Are we going to put out Mindfulness Mondays? What else are we going to do to make people remember that we've put a support matrix in place? Because very often we just put a support matrix in place, and this goes along the lines of employee assistance programs. I talk about EAPs all the time. I think they are the best safety net in the world. What's the point of a safety net? Never use it. Because if you use a safety net, it's like a crash helmet on a bike, isn't it? You spend a lot of money in the vac hope you never have to buy another crash helmet.
Yep.
As soon as you use the crash helmet, it's fulfilled its duty. You now need to go and buy another one. It's the same with employee assistance program. Let's have it there. Let's have it catching everybody. But what about if you've got some carabiners that you've attached to the trapeze ropes? Well, actually, people aren't going to fall off the trapeze at that point. So it's about being proactive, and you can only be proactive, really, if you're thinking about the long game, the strategy. What are we putting in place? And I quite often have conversations with organisations, and they're like, Simon, give me some training. Yes, I'd love to. What are you using it for? To make people's lives better. Wonderful. What are you using it for? What's going to happen? Who's going to support them? What's the policies you're putting in place at the background? What are the procedures that are going to fall out of this? Can we have some training? Do you not want to train us? And it's like, yeah, but all I'm doing is I'm giving you another safety net. You've got a different safety net over here. And if they fall through that safety net, you're okay because we've got a big safety net. So it's like, well, why are we not proactively telling the organisation we are going to make a change? We're all signing up to it. Call it a mental health or a well-being. Let's not call it mental health. Let's call it a health pledge. We're going to help to look after the health of all our employees, physical, mental, whatever that looks like, disabilities otherwise. And actually, we're going to put a plan in place to make sure that not that anyone's accountable. You can't necessarily be accountable, but we're going to put measures in place that we can see the success of what we've done. And oh, by the way, there'll be some training in it. But for me, turning away business is quite satisfying because I'm getting people to think about the long term. Because actually, just throwing a couple of training bits in pieces, that's brilliant. But actually, it's not part of the plan. And that's what we need to be driving towards. What's our stress management plan for our business?
And so looking at that from a long-term perspective, putting plans in place, policies in place, and, making sure there's safety net after safety net, and also a major safety barrier to keep everybody safe and well. What would be your top 3 tips for employers and employees when it comes to managing stress levels and improving health? So
employers listening, give this project to someone who cares. And I don't mean that as sort of, Sharon out of HR, she's very caring, but court or talk to your leadership team. Who has this as a passion? Who may have been off work with depression? Who may have or living with an anxiety disorder? Who really wants to create a difference within the organisation? That's not to say the CEO doesn't have that vision at all, but CEOs tend to be very busy. So give that task. Create us a stress management plan, whatever that looks like, and just come back with me with the findings. That's what I'd say to the employers. Just put someone in, not in charge of it, because you can never really have an owner from a mental health plan. You have stakeholders that agree they're going to be part of it. When we think about, and employees are the most important, obviously. When we think about the things that you can put in place, you have to recognize that the way that you think affects the way that you feel, and both thoughts and feelings affect your behavior. If you are going into work and it's a Sunday night dread, why is that? And Matt Champion, with his mindfulness sessions, I always give Matt a shout out on these things because he's just an incredible human being. He talks about naming it. What am I afraid of? What's my fight and flight? Why don't I want to go into work? Is it actually something to do with my home life? Is it something that I'm not reconciling before I go in? If we can name it, we tend to tame that thought process. So I'd say start to identify your stressors. What are the things that are causing you grief in that workplace, in that office? Is it the journey to work? Is it actually being there? Is it particular individuals in there? Once you've identified that, you can then say, well, what can I control now? How can I put a sort of, you said about barrier, a safety barrier, because I need a safety barrier around me. That would be my first tip to the employee, is to recognise what your stresses are. And then the last tip for the employee is coping strategies. And you and I have spoken about coping strategies many times. Write them down. There's probably not many people on there who's, well, I'll read a book, I'll listen to some music, or well, I'll play golf, or I'll go for a bike ride. Write them all down. Make a list, and then if you feel like prioritising it, what ones really make you happy and what ones make you okay happy. And if you write down, I just like the 7th episode of Only Fools and Horses, it puts me into fits of laughter and I can't think of anything else. Watch it every night. Use that coping strategy, build them up, leverage them, and then actually do it. Make yourself feel better. Even if it's for a small period of time, it will give you enough clarity of thought to then go on into the next stage, which is, well, I need to identify why because a coping strategy is just a point in time for us to de-stress. But we need to look at what's the cause of it in the first place. I've got my cause, I've got my coping strategies. How can I mix the two together or marry them together? And then knowing that my employer has actually got my back as well, which is really important.
Thank you. And some great tips and advice there for our listeners. And just, before we draw our discussion to a close, is there anything perhaps we haven't mentioned, or any other elements or tips you'd like to share?
The main thing for me, and I spend a lot of time with this, thoughts, feelings and behaviours. Reframing or distracting your thoughts will change how you feel, change how you behave. It's in our control, but quite often we feel it's out of our control because of the circumstances are out of our control, and we forget that actually we can ask for help. If we feel out of control, we can ask for help. And you might be thinking, well, no one will listen to me. If you go to a friend, a family member, and ask them for help, for the most part, they'll be able to help you. There'll be someone in your organisation who you feel comfortable talking to. It really is a problem shared is a problem halved. Just talk about how you're feeling. Even saying it out loud, all of those thoughts and feelings are going in your head, will make you make a change. And it might be you're really unhappy in your work at the moment, but you can't afford to get a new job. Well, for most of us, we can't ever afford to get a new job. But for our sanity, for our thoughts and feelings, we may have to behave in a different way. And that is, I need to talk about it. I need to have a conversation with my manager to say it's too much. It's just too much. Don't be afraid to open up and just tell people how you're feeling. If you tell people how you're feeling, you distract your thoughts, you'll change how you behave. You'll do something differently for you. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I suppose the old adage, if you don't ask, you don't get. Now, hopefully somebody will notice and will provide the support and help for you, but I think it's important. You need to talk about it. You need to ask for help, and don't be shy. Don't feel that it makes you look weak by asking for help. Everybody needs help with something, and by asking for it, it'll make your life easier as well on both ways. And that's not just from a stress perspective either. But Simon, thank you Really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Delighted to have you with us here at UK&I Connect, exhibiting and sharing your wisdom with our delegates and our whole community. And we hope you've enjoyed the conversation and found it valuable. To learn more about Thrive and our partnership, please do visit sapusers.org, our website, for more details, and that will be linked in the description as well. Until the next time, stay safe, stay well, and keep washing your hands.